I'd like to begin, Katharine, by asking you to just give a brief background to yourself, and particularly the influence of that background on how you became a Christian and how, as a Christian, you had developed this great interest in climate science.
Mm-hmm. So I had the dual advantage of growing up, first of all, in a family who taught me of God from an early age, but also with a father who was a science teacher.
Right.
So I grew up with the idea, first of all, that science is the most interesting, fascinating, coolest thing you could possibly ever study. And I grew up with the idea that how could science and faith possibly be in conflict? Because if we believe that God created this universe that we live in, then what is science other than trying to figure out what God was thinking when he set the whole thing up in the first place?
So there was never a conflict with
No, there never was, because from an early age I learned that when science and faith appear to be in conflict, as they certainly do with some issues, that it's typically because of our limited understanding. We are either interpreting the scriptures too narrowly, or we don't have the full picture on the science, or most likely both. And sometimes with some patience and humility, these differences can be reconciled. Sometimes they may not be reconciled within our lifetime. But if we start with the fundamental premise that they cannot possibly be in conflict, that brings us to a very different place and to a very different way of looking at faith and science than we typically see in discussions today.
Mm-hmm. And did you find that that was a rather isolated position? Did you find that conflict was the common thinking at the time, or no?
The first conflict that I experienced between science and faith, so to speak, came after I moved to the US as a graduate student studying climate science. Now, originally, I had begun by studying astrophysics, because what is more fascinating than the idea that using nothing more than our tiny brains on this relatively insignificant planet, that we can examine the furthest reaches of the universe? That's a pretty amazing thing to study. But when I was finishing my undergraduate degree, planning to go on to graduate school, I needed one more course. And I had already finished my minor in Spanish because I grew up as a missionary kid in South America. I'd already taken children's literature and all the courses that you take for fun. So I looked around, and there was a course on climate science over in the geography department. And I thought to myself, well, that looks interesting. So I took it.
Why was it interesting?
Well, because it was an aspect of science that I wasn't as familiar with. So I took this class, and it changed my life because of two things. First of all, I didn't realize that climate science was the exact same physics that I was already learning. I'm not sure what I thought it was, but it is all physics, the understanding of the planet. And the second thing I didn't realize was that climate change is a threat multiplier. So I had always mentally lumped climate change along with other environmental issues. So air quality, biodiversity loss, water pollution, climate change. I didn't realize that climate change takes all of these issues, but it also takes many humanitarian issues like poverty and hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, political instability, even refugee crises, and it exacerbates them, makes them worse. People are already suffering today because of the impacts of a changing climate. And so I felt to myself, how could I spend my life studying something that is personally very satisfying and fulfilling, but that doesn't make an immediate difference to people's lives today?
Why did you have that concern about making a difference to people's lives today?
Well, that concern came from my heart, not my head. I grew up as a missionary kid in South America, and when you live in a place where people are incredibly exposed to and vulnerable to natural disasters, it really opens your eyes to what suffering looks like. A hurricane that, when it hits the United States, causes 30 deaths, which are a tragedy, causes billions of dollars worth of damage. That same hurricane, if it hits a Caribbean island, can exacerbate a cholera epidemic that wipes out tens of thousands of people. It can destroy 100,000 homes. It can decimate an entire island and render it uninhabitable. So the very people who have contributed least to the problem of climate change are those who are most affected by a changing climate. And they are the people who I believe that we are told to love as Christ loved us.
So we come to that stage in our life when climate change is the new diversion for you. It's the new focus of your attention. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if I were to express to you the great ambivalence that there can be about climate change in the public domain, in the media, and even within academia at times, if I were to suggest to you that there is more evidence for the influence of natural solar variation, local weather patterns, people get more excited and they seem to grasp the concept of El Nino a lot easier than climate change. How would you respond to me if I were to say that?
Well, I get people saying those things to me every day.
Sure.
Many times a day, in fact, sometimes.
Yeah.
So as someone who, I live in the United States, I'm on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, I get letters, I get phone calls, I get emails, and many of them say those things. Don't you know the planet has been warmer before? It's just a natural cycle. It's just the sun. Or scientists haven't studied it long enough to be sure. But what we see is something very interesting. Within the same paragraph, often within the same sentence, they will continue to say, and so that carbon tax is just a government grab for my hard-earned money. Or so it's just a liberal hoax to take away my freedom. Or they'll even go further and say, it's a plan to let the Antichrist rule the world. Our science-y sounding objections to climate change are immediately and intimately linked to our aversion to what we perceive to be the only solutions, which are destroy the economy, take away people's personal liberties, let the United Nations rule the world. These are the things that people are told are the solutions. The reality, of course, is exactly the opposite. The solution is to wean ourselves off the old and frankly dirty ways of getting energy that we've been using for hundreds of years already, that have got us to where we are today, that have blessed us with the prosperity and the wealth and the high standard of living that we enjoy in the UK, in North America, and Western Europe today. We need to wean ourselves off those sources of energy onto the new sources of energy, which are just as God-given as the old, but do not carry with them the burdens of pollution and inequality that fossil fuels do. That is what we need to do in response, and by doing so we can actually increase our own way of life and also help those who are suffering the impacts of a changing climate today.
And if that is what we need to do, how do you actually persuade a doubting, at times cynical public that they should do that?
So often we feel that people don't have the right values to care. So we need to instill these new values in people to make them care about climate change. First of all, that doesn't work very well. If you're working with anybody over the age of about 12, they already have their values pretty much instilled. It's hard to get a new one in there. And they're happy, they're satisfied with who they are, with their identity. So the answer is not trying to change who people are, but rather showing people that who they already are is exactly the right person to care. How caring about a changing climate is a true and a genuine expression of their identity, and in fact, acting on climate is an even fuller expression of who they are. By making it something that is natural for us, that's where we can have the success. And so that's why it's so important to connect the dots between our faith and what we believe as Christians and why climate change matters. Because we are told that climate change is a new earth-worshipping religion, or that those scientists are all godless liberal atheists, or that you can care about the planet or you can care about people, but not both. And those, of course, are all lies. God created the planet and people. God gave us responsibility over every living thing on this planet, which includes plants and animals and people. And God gave us the resources and the brains that we can use to fix this problem. So that's why it's so important, I think, to connect those dots.
Thank you. One of the other central messages, as it were, I pick up from what you were saying or from your mission is the need for people to talk. What should we be talking about?
Yes. So the most frequent question that I get is, well, what can I do? because we're presented with this overwhelming global problem that each one of us is contributing to. But we know that even if we individually did everything we could, it wouldn't be enough.
Right.
So what can we do about it? It turns out that when you survey people and you say, do you think global warming is real? Most people, even in the United States, would say yes. And certainly in the UK and Canada. Do you think it will affect plants and animals, people in developing countries, future generations? Everybody says yes. Then you say, do you think it will affect you personally? Most of us say no, we don't think it matters to us personally. And then you say, do you ever talk about it? And the vast majority of people say no. So the connection is this. If we don't talk about something, why would we care? Because we talk about what we care about. If we don't care about it, why would we act? That is why I believe change begins with a conversation today, and that's something each one of us can do. Not a conversation about what divides us, but rather a conversation about what we most agree on, and then how what we agree on connects directly to a changing climate.
So, from what you say people don't talk about it because if they cared about it, they would talk about it. I guess the question is, why don't you think people care? Is it that they just don't care? Is it that they don't join the dots? Or what?
I think it's that we haven't connected the dots.
Right.
For most people, even today, climate change is something you care about if you are a tree hugger or if you are an environmentalist. And if you're not, then people say, well, that's just not what I care about. But the reality is, if we're a human, we already have every value we need to care about climate change. And if we're a Christian, even more.
Okay, that's a good
Good
point.
segue.
That's a good one to lead on to. Because how, as a Christian climate scientist now, can you interact, or do you interact constructively with the likes of the Cornwall Alliance and other groupings of that nature who take theology and scripture so seriously and who claim they take their view of the science so seriously? Now, you seem to be taking both seriously as well. How do you interact with those in such a way that there can be some positive good that can come out of that interaction without it becoming a shouting match?
Yes. So one tool I find very interesting is something called the 6 Americas of Global Warming. Now, they've applied this to other countries as well. But what it does is it shows that we are not just yes or no, black or white on this issue. So often we say, do you believe in climate change or do you not? I prefer to say I don't believe in climate change because it isn't a religion. But the 6 Americas of Global Warming breaks people up into different groups. So it isn't just yes or no. You have people who are alarmed, then you have people who are concerned. Then there's people who are cautious, and they're actually one of the biggest groups. So people who are cautious, my goal is to move people up to concerned. Then there's people who are disengaged, doubtful, and then there's a small group of people who in the US is only 9% of the population. In the UK it's even less, but they are the loudest voices and they are dismissive.
Right.
They are the ones that we hear in the media, that comment online, who say it's just a hoax, you scientists are making it up to line your pockets. We know that it's sunspots or natural cycles, it was warmer before, and wouldn't a little warming be better anyways? These are the dismissives. My personal definition of a dismissive is somebody who, if an angel from God appeared to them with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real, in foot-high letters of flame, they would dismiss it.
Right.
So what I've found is with somebody who is a dismissive, who has built their identity on rejecting the science of a changing climate in order to reject the necessity of action, which as a Christian I believe is actually profoundly against what we believe. We are told to build our identity not on the flesh, as Paul says, but on who we are as children of God. So I struggle not to build my identity on being a climate scientist, because that is not my identity. It's something I am right now, but in the future I might not be. But for someone who has built their identity on rejecting the reality of a changing climate and the need for solutions, it is virtually impossible to have a constructive, positive conversation. Because to somebody like that, asking them to change their mind about climate change is like asking them to amputate a body part almost. It's that much a part of their core identity. And so often those conversations are characterized by an immediate lack of respect. And if we cannot respect each other, we cannot have a constructive conversation. So when somebody who is dismissive confronts me, as they do almost daily on social media and frequently in person as well, my goal is to respond to them such that all of those watching know that we have answers. We know it really is humans. It is not a natural cycle. Warmer is not better for us humans, but there are solutions. But my goal is not to change a dismissive's mind, because I really honestly believe it takes a miracle to do that. I believe in miracles, but I don't believe that I'm the one who makes them happen.
Now, my research is in natural disasters. You heard the Faraday, and the book includes that, and indeed is based on that. I wonder if you can share with us, you make very clear in your writings and in your talks the link between climate change and the increase in the power of hurricanes and floods and droughts and so on, and therefore the link between climate change and the potential for increase in natural disasters. I wonder if you can, what's the evidence for that, basically?
Yes. One of the biggest ways that climate change is affecting us as humans is through loading the natural weather dice against us. So we always have a chance of rolling a double six. That is an intense hurricane, a devastating flood, a record-breaking heat wave, or more. What climate change is doing is it's taking these naturally occurring events and it's amplifying them or supersizing them. In some cases, like hurricanes, it's making them stronger. Because hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water, over 90% of the extra heat being trapped inside the climate system by all the heat-trapping gases we're producing is going into the ocean, where it's fueling stronger storms, and it's also increasing the amount of rainfall associated with a given hurricane. In the case of Hurricane Harvey, it was almost 40% more rain. And of course, the same is happening to cyclones and typhoons around the world, which are just hurricanes by a different name. We're also seeing that other events like heavy rainfall are becoming more frequent. Because in a warmer world, the atmosphere holds more water vapor. When a storm comes along, as it always does, there's now more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us today. We're seeing that heat waves are getting more intense and more frequent. And we're seeing other impacts like wildfire burning greater area as the weather gets hotter and drier over time. So these events are natural and they've always occurred, but they're getting stronger, more intense, and in some cases more frequent as a result of a changing climate. And that is one of the first ways that we personally, as individuals in the places where we live, are experiencing the negative impacts of a changing climate.
Now, another string to your violin, as it were, is the apparent increase in natural disasters around the world and the interpretations that people put upon that. Now, you bring out very much, again in your talks and writings, the human dynamics of that. The buck stops here, basically. With us.
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
To quote one of your presidents. There are others, particularly within the Christian fraternity, who would say, well, these are clear signs of the end times, the return of Christ.
Yeah.
And certainly in the work that I did in Haiti and in the Philippines and even in New Orleans, people were saying that kind of thing. That was very much becoming part of their narrative.
My taxi driver on the way here today said it's just a consequence of sin.
Right. What's your take on that?
So, in addition to the sciencey sounding objections that we often hear from people, it's just a natural cycle or it's just the sun, we often hear what I call religious-y sounding objections. The most common one is God is in control, humans can't affect something as big as this planet. And then the second most common one is, well, the world's going to end anyways. So why does this matter? In fact, it might actually speed it up. Maranatha.
Right.
So, to answer those questions, though, we don't go to the science, we go to the Bible. And of course, humans being humans. There were people being humans back then when Paul was writing his epistles. And of course, there were people back then when the New Testament was being written who thought that Christ's return was imminent,
Mm-hmm.
as in any day.
Sure.
So especially in Thessalonica, there were some of those people who were basically reading between the lines of what Paul wrote, quitting their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
sitting around, folding their hands, saying, well, Christ will return any day. And Paul wrote to them and essentially said, get off your rear, get a job, care for the widows and the orphans and the poor. We don't know the day or the time, but because of that, we are to live for today. We're not to worry about the past, as Jesus said. Nobody can add an hour to their life from worrying about the past. Similarly, we are not to look to the future other than to have the comfort of knowing that God is in control of our destiny. We are to live in the present, and living in the present, the greatest commandment we have is to love God and to love others, not just as ourselves, as Jesus said, but Paul upped the ante to love others as we have been loved by God.
I want to come now to something which I know is very dear to your own heart and dear to my own research as well. In his encyclical, Laudato Si', Pope Francis states, and if I may quote, "Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor," unquote. What can we do to ensure environmental care on the one hand, and which is so necessary to address climate change, but which is expensive, can help the majority world, and certainly those populations that I've done work amongst, where just getting a meal for the day to feed the family is a struggle?
Yes. This is the issue that we have, is that in fixing climate change, we must begin the steps towards a better world. Because just as climate change exacerbates poverty and hunger and disease and lack of access to clean water and environmental degradation and pollution, just as it exacerbates these things, so too the solutions that we look at must be solutions that also address these at the same time. The fact that many of the countries who are the poorest in the world do not have access to affordable fossil fuels, but they do have access to ample sun and often wind and tides as well. And so by transitioning to a clean energy system, we can actually help places that do not have access to the energy that we used in the past obtain energy of their own. Another solution that I'm particularly excited about is regenerative agriculture. The idea that by putting carbon from the atmosphere back in the soil, that's where we want it. Carbon in the soil actually fertilizes the soil. Biochar, which is burning agricultural residue at very high temperatures and then plowing it back into the soil, it's like Miracle Grow on steroids, as one ag expert described it to me. And that actually helps grow crops in areas that are average and marginal. So looking at tropical afforestation or reforestation, forest management, sustainable agricultural practices, figuring out how we can grow our food in ways that do not degrade the land or the soil, that continue to maintain people, not just today, but tomorrow and in future generations as well. That's what we need to do, but the good news is that actually helps with climate change too.
Just becoming or edging into what some might say is a slightly more controversial area.
I think we've covered a few controversial areas already.
Do you accept that, I mean, some of the problems, again, within the countries in which I work, is that there is, I suppose, what we would call today structural evil. In other words, there are systems, political systems, economic systems, which are not born actually by the countries that they are most affecting. They are born by my country, your country, high-income countries, who, as you say, don't suffer the real consequences of climate change. Do you think there's a role for Christians in trying to change structures, systems? And if so, how?
There are many parallels between climate change and slavery. Jean-François Mouhot is a French historian who studied some of the ways that people talked about slavery in the United States, some of the ways that they used their faith to justify the institution of slavery. But at the same time, it was Christians who led the charge against slavery. And they were powered by their beliefs, by our values, what we believe to be true. And so in the same way with climate change, we look at the massive injustices that fossil fuels perpetuate around the world. We know today that fossil fuels are responsible for about 4.5 million deaths from air pollution alone around the world. Most of those people are people who cannot afford to live somewhere where they're not exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. We also know that the extraction of fossil fuels carries tremendous injustices in many developing countries. In the Niger Delta, which is one of the major sources of oil and gas in Africa, the environmental impacts of oil spills on unborn babies, on small children, on pregnant mothers are so massive and widespread that it has its own Wikipedia entry.
Right.
The country that I grew up in, Colombia, the northern peninsula of Colombia, the Guajira, supplies much of the coal used in Ireland and Germany and countries that would call themselves clean. Their remaining coal comes from a country where the coal mining in that region uses up all the water. And so when they are in drought, as they have been for the last few years, the native populations, many of whom are very impoverished, go without water. What water there is polluted by the coal mining. And so people have started to refer to that type of coal as blood coal, as they used to refer to diamonds as blood diamonds. There are injustices that we are blinded to. There's a curtain in front of where we source our energy from. So it isn't just a case of that energy causing a changing climate that impacts people living in other places. It's a case of actually where we get our resources from sometimes affects them too. And that's why, again, connecting this issue directly to our values is so important. Because why should we care? We care because of who we are. Who we are is who God has made us. Somebody who, he's taken out a heart of stone and he's put in a heart of flesh. He's given us a heart to love and to care for other people, to have compassion on others, to care about them even more than we care about ourselves. That's who we are, and that's why caring about a changing climate is that part of who we are, a genuine expression of our God-given identity.
Thank you very much, Katharine.
Thank you.